play to listen to this article. Donald Trump never had many climate friends, and after this week, the US president looks even more alone. There's a sense that there's been significant movement on climate issues in just the last few days. China, the biggest polluter on the planet, used the UN General Assembly this week to announce it would be carbon neutral before 2060. That came less than a week after the EU proposed a sharply tightened target for slashing emissions by 2030. World leaders are meeting virtually in New York Thursday for a UN-sponsored climate roundtable. The UN and the UK said they would celebrate the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement in December with an event asking all governments to deliver ambitious and high-quality climate targets, and California said it would ban combustion engine cars within 15 years. The EU and China together account for more than a third of man-made carbon emissions and, crucially, global economic power. Their climate pledges remain to be written into law and made real with policy, but they have agreed to hold regular high-level talks aimed at boosting their efforts. This re-emergence of a coalition of major countries is happening in the absence of the US, which will formally leave the Paris deal on November 4, the day after the presidential election. Guterres gambled a revival that UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, who was elected just 26 days before Trump, had gambled on. The US president's decision to leave the Paris Accord in June 2017 was an existential challenge to the UN, said Robert Orr, Dean of the Public Policy School at the University of Maryland, who has advised the last 3 Secretaries General, including Guterres. If Trump had led an exodus of other countries from the deal or simply rendered it ineffective, international climate cooperation would end up like the UN. Security Council, World Health Organization or World Trade Organization, all waylaid by the Trump-led US disengagement from international bodies. In the weeks after Trump won the White House, Guterres huddled with Orr. It was unfathomable that the UN would ignore climate change, but Guterres had to decide whether to step back, shielding himself and the UN, or stake the reputation of the multilateral system on the success of the Paris Agreement. The support for the deal was still out there, Orr counseled. The calculation was the US would oppose and some others would follow or hide behind the US, but that we would get significant traction in other parts of the world. Any countermeasures came with political and financial risks. The US pays about a fifth of the UN budget. Indeed, the Trump administration has tried repeatedly to cut that funding and has partly been thwarted by Congress. It also came with some personal political risk for Guterres. Opposition from a permanent member of the Security Council would jeopardize his re-election should he choose to seek a second term in 2021. During Guterres' first 2 years in the job, the political momentum to solve climate change stalled. The US action, it fundamentally undermined that race to the top and put us into a much more holding pattern, hold the line, and I think that's the biggest lasting damage at the international level that the Trump administration's approach to climate caused, said Orr. Inside the UN, officials were frustrated at a perceived lack of tactical thinking. There was no strategic conversation involving agency chiefs, said Eric Solheim, who led the UN Environment Programme from 2016 until 2018. Another high-ranking former official said, "I never heard or saw a real Plan B emanate out of the 38th floor of the UN building in New York where the Secretary-General has his office." The UN tends to be irrelevant in a world where states are dramatically strengthened and where business is basically the key driver of the positive climate response, said Solheim, likening the failure to move countries forward on climate change to the World Health Organization's inability to coordinate the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Things changed when Guterres went to the Pacific in the spring of 2019. He was moved. He emotionally engaged with the subject matter for the first time and came back from that trip a transformed man, said the former official. On that trip, According to the former official, Guterres stood in front of the mirror of a hotel bathroom in New Zealand, practicing a new climate mantra. He rolled it out in a speech for the first time at a breakfast with school students in Auckland: tax pollution not people, stop subsidies to fossil fuels, stop the construction of new coal plants by 2020. President Donald Trump announces his intention to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement at the White House in June 2017, when Mac Mimi/Getty Images the kids were charmed. But his comments set off a firestorm inside the UN. Immediately the official received a call from an irate colleague: "He can't say that. He can only say what we tell him to say." Officials worried about blowback, not just from the US, but big coal countries such as China, India, Australia and others. Critics inside the UN said it was the desperate grandstanding of a diminished Secretary General. "I think he did the right thing. That was his job," said Luis Alfonso de Alba, who served as Guterres' special envoy organizing a climate summit in New York in September 2019. That climate summit was notable for failing to induce any meaningful new commitments from leaders of large economies. But it deliberately contrasted their inaction with the energy of youth activists and business leaders. For aspiring climate champions such as German Chancellor Angela Merkel, it was an uncomfortable experience. Green pressure this year. Guterres ramped it up further. In a speech in China, where a massive new wave of coal power plants had been approved, he said, "Coal should have no place in any rational recovery plan." In India, he said the coal business was going up in smoke. While calling them out in public, according to OR, Guterres talked about climate in private with the leaders and governments of all major economies, including the US and China. Guterres increasingly focused on a set of precise, universal policy demands he believes should shape post-COVID-19 stimulus packages. That theme was a feature of Chinese President Xi Jinping's speech to the UN this week. Xi Jinping, a top Chinese advisor, said Guterres had called him and urged China toward a green recovery. His pressure on China has worked in tandem with European leaders, including French President Emmanuel Macron, Merkel, and European Commission Vice President Frans Timmermans. This careful effort to keep the climate show on the rails has faced some organized resistance from the Trump administration. The White House has tried to stymie the UN's pitch. During last year's COP25 climate summit in Katowice, Poland, the US promoted nuclear and fossil fuels. Guterres left with Trump at the UN headquarters in September 2019, drew anger/Getty Images. The US wasn't completely absent. State Department diplomats still attended UN meetings and were mostly constructive. For Guterres and his team, there were still open doors in the Trump administration. "They maintained a relationship with us," said de Alba, "but that tentative outreach is now overshadowed by big movements on climate policy." Xi's announcement Tuesday said the Paris Agreement charts the course for the world to transition to green and low-carbon development. China's aim to end its emissions would cut between 0.2 degrees and 0.3 degrees from the global temperature if achieved, according to Climate Action Tracker. Trump spoke just before Xi, calling the Paris Agreement one-sided and denouncing China's pollution and rising carbon emissions. He ended his speech in a clarion call for unilateralism. "As president, I have rejected the failed approaches of the past, and I am proudly putting America first, just as you should be putting your countries first." This article is part of Politico's premium policy service, Pro Energy and Climate. From climate change, emissions targets, alternative fuels and more, our specialized journalists keep you on top of the topics driving the energy and climate policy agenda. Email pro@politico.eu for a complimentary trial. Related stories on these topics. Let's block ads. Why?
Show your love for him. Click the link in description. Thanks for watching.